I'm going to give a couple of more seconds to people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. So hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Akshay from Decisions, and I'll be your host for Lunch and Learn today. On this session, we try to help our customers and prospects answer some of the questions they might have working on the tool. You can use the chat option, or you can use the Q&A option to send your questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. So I saw there was one question from someone, if we can record in some way that the person who's submitting a form as a guest is a legit person. So natively on our forms, we do not have the CAPTCHA option. So we don't have that as a native option on our forms, but we can work around something like, writing a JavaScript control on our form to embed that, so that when somebody is entering the details, they would have to click on that CAPTCHA part of the form to validate that they are a user. And there could be some other technical ways of integrating and finding that. So for that, I would request you to drop an email to the support team. If somebody has worked on something like that, they'll be happy to answer that in details as per the exact use case that you're trying to solve, Manal.
Gotcha. Quick question. So I was also thinking, since I'm using the guest account, it just gives you the link, and as soon as they click on the link, they open the form.
Right.
Is there any way like you can have a string set up, and then when they're about to submit a form, the dialog box shows up, and then you're like, hey, you have to write down this string, and this string makes sure that it matches whatever they type in? Is there any way we can do that?
Yeah, that's a good way too. So what will happen in that case, Mana, is so when what you would do is in the flow that you have, which has a form. So as soon as you kick off that flow, let's say, before you actually come to the form part of the workflow, before that, have a step that generates a unique ID, let's say, okay, and store that in the DB or somewhere, or you can just keep that within the flow. So now you have that ID, and you can just display that ID on that form so that they actually type it, or make sure that they're entering that. And when they click on submit, then you're going to check if this ID is actually equivalent to what you want them to submit. And if it's a yes, then you can just continue. Otherwise, you can just show them some error that this is an invalid entry or something. Does that help, Manal?
Well, so I got to the part where I built a little like form which just have a text, and it says like enter the similar text. I'm having a difficulty where I'm like, how do I match it? So for example, if I created a character which says write down this is my computer, how do I make them like actually like check it?
Yeah, so what you can do is you would be actually running validation flow there. And what will happen is, as you are displaying that as a label, what you can do is you can also have a hidden text box somewhere on your form, on some header or footer, let's say. Now that text box will not be visible, but it will contain a value that you can match with the actual text box where they are entering that string. So when they click submit, you will run a validation flow, or like an active form flow, which does a quick check if the value they have entered in that text box is equivalent to the hidden text box that you have.
Gotcha. And is there like any example on the project side? Do you have on the support side like similar to those, or there's?
I'm not very sure but this is an easy fix as you are
Mhm.
talking about it. So this is something that you can definitely do. Passing in that string that you, and it would be a unique string every time you would run that form because it's being generated as a get ID in the previous step.
Get it.
Let me actually show you that where you can find that. But one sec.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to create a quick flow here. Now, let's say you have a form, right, as per your workflow, and it's somewhere here as part of a process. Maybe there are some initial steps running, but that's okay. So you would put generate string step somewhere here, let's say, and then you would pass that as an input to this form that you have here. So you would go to sec, it's freezing a bit for me, the cursor. So you go to integration, then you go to internal services, and then you go to something called as ID generation. Okay, and then here you can use a normal GUID step, or this helps you to actually write something that is more meaningful. So you can just put that here, and then you're gonna give a prefix or something like that, check, and it would follow a unique number every time you run this flow. Okay, now this is something that you can pass on your string, so you can call that as a unique check string. And on your form, let's see if I have any sample form which I can use, or maybe I could just create one. So here you would pass in as a label so that it would be a unique label. So it could be just, let's say, label here, and it would come from a data. Now this data is actually that unique ID which we generated previous to this step in the flow. So I'm going to call it unique check ID. And on top, you can have something like enter this ID below. And then here you would have actually a check drop text box where they would actually be typing in that thing. So you can call that as type unique ID. Now, all you would do here is either you can use an active form flow, or you can use a legacy flow where you can just do a validation rule. And this validation rule will essentially be that this ID that is coming in has to be equal to this ID for this user to successfully submit this request. Now you may ask that, how can I pick this value which is coming in? Now you can pick it because it might be coming as an input, or if that also doesn't work out, what you can do is you can just drop a text box here, which would actually be taking in the same value. You can keep the name same, and you can just hide that. So when the user logs in, they're not going to see this, but you are still holding a value for you to check. But you can also define an input value here, which would be same for this label, and also that, so there's no need to do this trickery also. Now, the next thing you would do is you would define that validation flow. So let's see in the legacy validation rule. Now, in this validation rule, you're going to create a rule that will check this value if it's equal to this value. Does that help? Am I understanding what I'm talking about?
So quick thing. So if I do create a validation and I say equal, but I don't know the unique ID it will produce, how would I because I know it's case sensitive and I will have to have an exact thing, or am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, you can define it the way you want. Maybe, I mean, what's the question? So, I mean, they have to enter exactly the same ID that they see here into this text box for you to, for them to have successful validation.
Gotcha. But like whenever I'm creating my validation rule, I say like string equals,
Yeah.
and then it gives me a constant. It's like enter whatever you want it to be entered, but I don't know the unique ID that it will produce every single time. So like what will how do I say it? Like
Okay. One second. Let me show you that. Okay, no problem. So here I would run a rule and we'll check unique IDs. And I would say big create. I would create. Now I'm going to define two values here. One is that they are entering, one is that we are getting generated, and I'm going to have enter, let's say. So this is what they will enter, and this is what we would be generating before they actually see the form. So I'm going to save that. Now here, I'm going to say that if the generated value equals, and I'm going to select it from flow and say entered value, give me a success. Otherwise, I'm going to show that they have entered the wrong value there. So I'm going to click save. Now you see we have these inputs entered versus generated. So in the generated one, I'm going to pick a component and it will be unique check ID. And in the entered, I'm going to map this to form control, which is typed unique ID. And then I can just say, you know, to which control do I want to apply that to? So I think in this case, it's going to be this text box. And we can say the trigger. Now you can have different triggers like just change value or something. Let's say you can have a change value as well. Or you can also have it on some other control that you might have on your phone. And you can mention what error would you like to show them here. Any questions so far? You know, what we're doing here?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I was trying
Makes
to
sense,
create a
right?
constant string rather than actually just using from select from flow. It's like I was doing it wrong. Sorry.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So let's see if this works. I'm not sure it's going to work, but the concept is this. Let's see. I would map the unique ID with unique check string, and we can ignore that. So this is how they would see. Now this value would be like how you define that. So I'm going to pass in check. Let's say I pass in 3 or something. So you see it's notifying that there's something wrong. Now you can define your own way of indicating what's wrong. It could be like a text message here or the default pattern of showing it here. As you can see, the validation rule broken. But if I pass in 2 here, I'm all good. I can submit. Does
That
that help?
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes. And
And you can define your own funky value here that makes more sense. I mean, this is just for an example purpose. I just took check and some unique number. Yeah.
gotcha. That makes sense a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. It could be like a generate a random name like John Smith, and they have to pass in John Smith here. So you can be creative at this part because you have all the flexibility of what kind of ID you would want to show there on the form. Yeah, I
Got
think this should work. Yeah.
gotcha. And then the ID number just changes. For example, at 1, it will at 2, it will at
Yeah,
3
it'll
next
change
time.
every time. Exactly. So if I debug that once again, so you would see maybe 3 this time. You
Okay.
see 3 this time. Yep.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. All right, so let's see. I think we have a hand raised from Wade on our attendees. So yeah, please go ahead, Wade. You can use the chat option, or you can just talk, I guess, if you have the access.
Hello.
Hey, hi, Wade.
I have a flow that I'm publishing as an API service.
Okay.
And I'm trying to, whenever we call the flow, it gives us the flow ID, and I'm trying to add an output. And I went to the end step and added an output, and it shows up on when I view the API service, but it's not actually coming out. Is that because on this flow I have like between the beginning and the end, I have like a REST call and a couple forms and that sort of thing. I mean, is that why?
Oh, okay. So you said you have a form?
Yeah, I have two forms. Yeah, potentially.
Okay. So typically for an API to run, it doesn't have to have like a form inside that, because if it has a form, then instead of API, you would be using something called as user interface in that. So, and when you are using interface, it will help you display that form on an iframe or a form like that. So in this case, let's take an example of this this build that I was just doing. So let me undo that and have a form back. So if I want to call that an API service, now you see we have a form in this. So something funny will happen now. Let me also open Postman just to do a quick check.
Yeah, we're using we're using it as an API service because our ERP system is initiating the flow, and then it's making assignments to certain users to fill out a form.
And it's working for you?
Yeah. So yeah, our ERP system initiates the call, it starts the flow, and then it assigns makes an assignment as a task for a set of users. Yeah, it works. So the only thing that doesn't work is whenever our ERP system makes the call, it only gets back the flow ID, or not the flow ID, the flow tracking ID.
Yeah, and that's precisely what I was talking about. So let's say I'm calling this simple flow which has a form in it as an API. And what's going to happen now if I make a call is that it's also going to return me just the flow tracking ID. I think this is what you are seeing.
That's the only thing that comes back.
Yeah. And I think that's usually happen when there's a form in the flow and we are trying to use that as an API. So if in this case, if I want to pass out some value, let's say I want to pass out these things as well. It's going to remain the same, so you don't need to copy it too. So even I passed out those outputs there on my flow to return, it just returns me this flow tracking ID. And this is because the way the API with form in it behaves. So in your case, Wade, are you trying to consume some information as well as part of that API?
So in the beginning, in the call from our ERP system, they give us we call it a stop number and the requester.
Okay.
Stop number is just number. The requester is an email. We send that to the flow, then that starts the flow. Then it makes a REST call and then sets up a process folder and then goes to the form.
And it's working as you're describing.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean it's able to assign tasks and get that number through that API call. So what's the missing key here? Are you trying to grab some data?
Yeah, I mean the missing key is I want that our ERP system, whenever it makes that flow call, to get back. I mean the flow tracking ID is okay, but I would more prefer the process folder unique number that it is created.
I see. Okay, I see. So I think, what I would do in your case is that when we are running this flow, so what you can do is it's something that just comes off out of my mind without thinking much. But what I would do is when we are getting anything generated in the flow, I would just save that in a database here. Okay. Now, this database will have the details about that particular execution of that ERP call. It can have a unique ID and all the relations, all the attributes for that particular flow. Now, once I have that database here, then I can run another API just to fetch that information and grab all the details for that particular transaction or call by the API.
Okay.
Makes any sense? Let me also say something.
So I'm making a second call and sending that.
Yeah. You're making a call to a flow that doesn't have a form in it, because if it has a form, it's going to always return you the flow tracking ID.
Okay.
But in that way, in that part of solution, you would have all the information, and that call would just be like a database call, like a fetch step, and it would give you all the details on the basis of some key that is unique to that particular run. Yeah.
If I would run it as a subflow, if the form was in a subflow, would that still?
Yeah. So if the
it?
API call has a flow in it, it is going to return you just the flow tracking ID.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think this would be like a nice way to get around that by just storing that in a very small database that can have just basic attributes, and then making a call to that database on certain key that's being generated in the previous subsequent steps. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Sweet. All right, so I'm going to keep it open for some more time. And if we have any more questions, feel free to drop in. Okay, sure. Go ahead, Manal. Yeah.
I'm sorry, one more question.
No
Actually,
problem.
sorry,
Please
let
go
me
ahead. Yeah,
ignore
we have
this.
all the time. Yeah.
So I know you said like to just put in a support ticket to see if somebody puts in a data in the form. For example, if they already used one of these state, then they can't use that state on any other form. That's going to be a support ticket, just to confirm.
I didn't quite follow your question. Is it the same question about the bot submitting requesting?
It's pretty similar to that. So what we are trying to get is on the form, they have some fields, for example, a country and an address. If the address can only be for one place. So for example, I submitted a request and I put address Houston, Texas.
Correct.
Then new person comes in, they cannot use the same address. For example, if they start typing in Houston, Texas, it should give them a validation error. Hey, this has already been used.
Okay.
So I was trying to build a form where I did the validation. It's just like, I can't understand the reason of how to get the backend forms, like the submitted ones, and to run it against them, the fields.
Okay. And no problem. So this form that you're talking about, let's say somebody comes in and fills in Houston, Texas, and they submit that. So is the next person or the same person coming back to the same form and they cannot use the same address? Is that
Oh no, whenever they submit a new form. So if that field one time Houston, Texas is used once from that one user, it cannot be used by any other user.
But the flow and the form is the same, right?
Yes, they just like, yes.
Yeah, so what you will do in that case is, so you would create a quick database table, right? It would have let's say the address, in it, and some unique ID which you would want to maybe just have for sake of retrieving it. Okay. Now, what will happen is when you submit this form once with Houston, Texas in that, so you would just create that entry on that form. Okay. Now, the next time you run that flow, you would have a fetch entity step here. Or instead of having fetch entity here, you can just run that on the form as well to do some validation. So let me actually go inside that and use the same one. Okay. So what will happen here is, let's say, let me drag and drop this. It's a little slow here for me. And I call that as address, let's say. Now, what will happen is when somebody clicks Houston and submitted it for the first time, I am going to run a flow which will save this address in that database table. Okay. And the next time when somebody comes in and they type in this, so we're going to do a validation check by seeing if this address exists in that small database which you have created. If it exists, that means, we have a red flag and we can just show them that this address has already been used. Is it making sense?
Yes.
Or you want me to create something?
Can you create something
Okay.
more
Okay. Yeah.
present? Thank you.
No problem. Yeah. Let's create something here then. Okay. I mean, I would prefer defining that outside. So let's create a quick database table. So I'm going to create a quick table here, and we would call that as a database table. We would just say used addresses, and it will be like an ID for that address that's being used. And then we would have the actual address. Okay. And I'm going to save it. So I'm running a virtual machine here on my device, and somehow it's a little slow. Maybe I'm consuming a lot of resources in my actual environment. So that's why it's a little slow. So apologies for that.
It's all good. Thank you so much for showing me this. I spent like 4 hours yesterday
Yeah,
trying
no
to
problem.
figure it out. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is just one way. So it's always the case when we are solving problems on decisions, for one particular thing, there could be 3 different ways. And if you talk to 3 people, they would provide you 3 different solutions. So I'm just giving you one of them here. So let's say when somebody is interacting with this flow here, and at this point, we would just save that address. So I'm going to use the save entity step here. I'm going to come into my database structures. Look for the used addresses, and I'm going to create it here. So it's going to be like a small build here, and unique ID would actually be this checked ID, which is being generated by this little step here, just to keep some uniformity. And this address would be coming from my form. So I'm going to select from flow and click on address. So now what this means is if the address is being used for the first time, it could be Houston or any other address, it's going to get saved if it's used for the first time. And the next time somebody wants to use it, we're going to do a check on the form and validate if this address already exists in this database that we have created. So far, so good. Any questions? Okay. So let's see what the name is. The name is address. Perfect. So I'm going to create another legacy flow. Now you can use active form flows. I mean, I'm just using legacy for no reason here. So I'm going to put in another validation rule. And in this case, I'm going to use a flow for this purposes. And let's check. Check address flow. And I can pick or create. Now here, I'm going to use a step called fetch step here. Fetch entities. And on the first tab, I would just define that address as the input so that we can pass into this. Now, in actual situation, you would have to kind of do it in a way that they are selecting some drop down or something. So, it's not like a mismatch of spelling and it gets through. So you got to be like careful with that. But in this case, let's say I have this unique used address. And then I can use something like fetch here, and I can say contains or equals. So you can use whatever depending on what kind of control you are providing them to provide the address. Well, so in this case, I'm going to use, like, let's say contains, and I'm going to say address. And here I'm going to map the address from the input. So we're going to check if the address we are entering is contained in this database already. And there would be like 2 steps coming out of it. True and false. Let's see what this is. Issues. Right. I'm going to switch to method 1 here because I'm not very sure of that. So let's do one thing here. So instead of fetching that inside, I'm going to use it here. We can work on that also, but it would take me some time to test that and see what would be the right way. So in this case, I'm going to use the same use address database. And then it's going to give me, a list of all the use addresses, which I can check inside my form. I'm going to run that. And
Actually, just a quick question. So
sure.
why are we creating the list box? Just so
No,
we can hide it?
just to contain, yeah, just to hide it. But actually, you would be using input data. So
Okay, gotcha.
yeah.
Makes sense.
That's the reason. I mean, I can use this also, but it'll just take me like I can go wrong in the first go. So that's why I'm just using the happy path here. But yeah, idea would be to just set up an input and then just pass that what I'm passing into this in that place. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So now what I'm going to do is so I'm going to map this with entities and all address. So now our form will contain all the addresses that there are in the system. And then I'm going to go back to my form. And now I can create a quick validation rule. Check address. Now I would define two inputs here. One would be the entered address, and the other would be used addresses.
Gotcha. And that would be the list, right?
Yeah, that would be the list, exactly. So I'm just going to say that here, if the entered address is in the list, which is essentially the used addresses, sec, and I would just map this with the used addresses. So if it's there, then that means we have a validation error to show to the user. Just like the previous one, we would just update the inputs. Entered would be a form control, call address. Okay. And then the user address. Let's use address and click OK. And then we can define, what would be the text that you would want to show them. And then you can apply it to the controls. So I think in this case, it's going to be address text box. And you can also mention the triggers if some value changes. Let's say address value changed. And click OK. So let me connect that with this the first time. Okay, I see what's happening here. Now our DB has a value inside that. So now if we run that again, and let's select it from flow. Okay, so I think I have to switch the true and false. So what's happening now is if you're taking some other address, it's showing the error, but it should be other way around. So if you see, I remove the A here and it checks in that list, it exists. So it's showing no error there, as you can see. So we got to reverse that logic in the rule. That's all.
Gotcha. So like, for example, you have the list and you had to add it as a constant, but how would, for me, it will just be input data? Like I will just use input data on the form?
You would just be using input data, instead of this control,
And that would,
that input data would be mapped to this list of entities dot, just like how we have here. Let me show you. So it's going to be like entity results dot all addresses. So that input data will be list of all the addresses in the existing database. Yeah.
Gotcha. And I will have to do that step on the fetch entities too.
No, fetch entity, this is fine. I mean, this fetch entity is totally fine. This is just retrieving the information. Then you would just be adding that here. So when we add, let's say setup input data, I define an input data. So I can say used addresses, and it's going to be like a list. Okay. And all this means is that you have just defined that input, so you can use this in the validation flow or other active form flows you have, instead of using this list box now. And the mapping would remain just the same. So I come back, and now here you would see we will have an input. Should have the input. Use the same name, so I think that's why it's getting confused. So come here back. So you see here, now we have this used addresses input. Now, instead of using this one, you would just map it with the fetch entity results and then all address. Now you have the input against which you want to compare. And the input that needs to be compared is anyway taken inside the form. So this is what I'm talking about. If I scroll a little, this addresses. So you can just ignore it here because this is being entered by the user on the form during the session.
Gotcha. And then, like, for example, you had to add HAT, like Houston, Texas, like constant wise. Would I have to do that too in order to like force it that it's in the list?
No. I just did that to create one entry. So that's all. I mean, to populate something in the database. That's what I did there. So in your case, you won't have to do that manually. So what will happen now is if the address is new, it's going to go successfully and it would create this address. And next time when we run fetch, instead of HUTA, we would have, let's say, some address of California as well in this database. And when the user tries to address that as California, it's going to check against the list because we already have that saved. And it's going to throw that validation error on the form.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you so much.
So it's like, no problem. So it's like creating new. So we would create new only if the form gets successfully submitted. And the form will get successfully submitted only if the address doesn't exist in the actual list of the database addresses. Yeah.
Gotcha. And that would be run by the validation flow. It's
exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you so much, Akshay. This helps a lot.
Yeah, no problem. Awesome. All right, team. Any other questions from anyone? All right, if you don't have any question, I think we can give back 15 minutes back to their time, everybody's. And again, thanks a lot for joining in. So just to reiterate, we have lunch and learns every day from Monday to Thursday, 12 to 1 EST times. All right.
Thanks, Akshay.
All right, close it, I think, yeah.